Forget everything you think you know about the Syrian conflict and Iran's role in managing the Assad government's strategic survival. What happened 72 hours ago in the Damascus suburbs is not a tactical adjustment. It is not a military exercise gone public. It is a fundamental break in a relationship that has defined Middle Eastern power dynamics for more than a decade, and the reverberations are only beginning. Syrian Arab army units operating Russian-supplied Pantsir S-1 air defense systems engaged and destroyed four Iranian Shahed 136 loitering munitions over the southern approaches to Damascus International Airport. Those munitions were Iranian military assets operating in Syrian airspace under what both governments have publicly described as integrated defense cooperation. Syrian air defense crews locked onto Iranian drones received fire authorization from Syrian Command Authority and destroyed them. That happened. And it represents something that intelligence analysts across three continents are still working to fully comprehend. I need you to understand that I spent years in military intelligence environments where the Syria-Iran relationship was treated as effectively unbreakable. That assessment was built on solid operational reality. Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps elements have operated on Syrian soil since 2012. Iranian weapons have flowed through Syrian territory to Hezbollah for decades. Iranian strategic depth has depended on Syrian cooperation, and Syrian survival has depended on Iranian intervention. What happened this week violates every operational assumption about how these two governments coordinate military activity in shared battle space. The Syrian Ministry of Defense issued a statement 6 hours after the engagement. The language used in that statement represents a diplomatic earthquake that mainstream reporting has almost entirely missed. The ministry did not describe the incident as a coordination failure or a technical malfunction of identification systems. It described the Iranian drones as having violated Syrian airspace sovereignty and having posed an unacceptable security risk to critical infrastructure. That language is not the language of allied militaries managing a friendly fire incident. That is the language of adversarial engagement. Stay with me because what I am about to walk you through represents one of the most significant intelligence puzzles to emerge from the Middle East in years. The Pantsir S-1 is a Russian-made combined gun and missile system designed for short to medium-range air defense. Syria operates approximately 18 of these systems, all supplied by Russia between 2008 and 2019. The system uses phased array radar with target acquisition range up to 42 kilometers and engagement range for the missile component reaching 20 kilometers. The gun system, twin-barrel 30mm autocannon, provides point defense within 4 kilometers. Every one of these systems operates under integrated air defense network architecture that Russia helped Syria construct and that Syrian and Russian command authorities share operational coordination for. That integration exists specifically to prevent exactly what happened this week, fratricide between forces operating in the same battle space on theoretically aligned missions. Iranian forces in Syria have transponder systems and operational coordination protocols with Syrian air defense precisely so Syrian radar operators can differentiate Iranian assets from hostile targets. For Syrian Pantsir crews to engage Iranian drones, several things had to happen simultaneously. First, either Iranian transponder systems were deliberately disabled, or Syrian forces chose to override identification protocols that would have flagged those drones as friendly. Second, Syrian Command Authority had to authorize weapons release against targets that any competent air defense network would have immediately identified as Iranian Shahed 136 platforms, which have extremely distinctive radar signatures and flight profiles that differ completely from Turkish, Israeli, or U.S. drone systems that Syria routinely tracks. Third, this authorization had to come from command levels high enough to understand the diplomatic implications of destroying Iranian military assets. The Shahed 136 itself represents critical context. This is not a reconnaissance platform. It is a delta-wing loitering munition with approximately 40-kilogram warhead designed for strikes against fixed targets at ranges exceeding 2,000 kilometers. Iran has supplied these systems to Russian forces operating in Ukraine, where they have been employed against power infrastructure and military logistics nodes. The presence of four Shahed 136 platforms approaching Damascus International Airport means either Iran was conducting an operation in Syrian territory without Syrian coordination, or Syria decided that Iranian operational activity had become unacceptable regardless of coordination status. Let me walk you through what the operational intelligence picture tells us about Iranian force posture in Syria as of last month, because this context proves essential. Iran maintains between 2 and 3,000 IRGC personnel on Syrian territory at any given time, distributed across approximately 15 significant installations ranging from the Damascus area to positions near the Iraqi and Lebanese borders. These forces operate air defense systems, ballistic missile launchers, command and control facilities, and logistics networks supporting Hezbollah resupply operations. That presence represents Iran's primary strategic depth mechanism, the terrestrial bridge connecting Iranian territory to Lebanese Hezbollah positions facing Israel. That bridge, that geographic continuity of force projection capability, represents tens of billions of dollars in Iranian investment over more than a decade. It represents the infrastructure through which Iran can directly threaten Israel without operating from Iranian territory. It represents the reason Israel has conducted hundreds of airstrikes against Iranian positions in Syria while carefully avoiding direct strikes against Syrian government forces. The distinction between Iranian and Syrian assets in Syrian territory has been the critical variable preventing Israeli operations from triggering direct Israeli-Syrian military confrontation. Before we go any further, I need you to understand something about weapon system engagement protocols and integrated air defense networks. The decision to fire on an air target requires positive identification as hostile, authorization from appropriate command level, and assessment that engagement serves operational necessity rather than creating disproportionate risk. In the case of the Damascus airport engagement, Syrian forces had to affirmatively conclude that destroying Iranian drones served Syrian interest enough to accept the inevitable diplomatic crisis that would follow. Keep watching, because the next part is where this moves from tactical incident to strategic fracture. Within 18 hours of the engagement, Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesman Nasser Kanani issued a statement demanding explanation and describing the incident as requiring immediate investigation by both governments. That language sounds measured until you understand that Iranian diplomatic communication with Syria has never in the past decade employed the formal demand and investigation framework that Iran typically reserves for interactions with adversarial governments. Syrian response came not from the foreign ministry, but from a senior Syrian Arab Army general officer who stated in an interview with Syrian state media that Syrian forces would defend Syrian sovereignty against any violations regardless of source. The general did not use the phrase Iranian violations explicitly, but the context made the target unmistakable. That statement came from a uniformed military officer, not a diplomatic official, and it established Syrian government position that military necessity authorized the engagement. What the mainstream media will not tell you is how this incident connects to three separate developments that occurred in the 6 weeks preceding the Damascus engagement. First, Russia substantially reduced the operational tempo of its military coordination with Iran and Syria, redeploying air defense assets closer to Russian installations and creating separation between Russian and Iranian operational zones. Second, Syrian government officials conducted a previously unannounced diplomatic engagement with Emirati and Saudi representatives, meetings that occurred without Iranian participation, despite Iran's normal insistence on involvement in any Syrian diplomatic initiative involving Gulf states. Third, Israeli strikes against Iranian positions in Syria increased in both frequency and depth, hitting targets farther from the Israeli border and closer to Syrian government installations, with notably restrained Syrian government response. Those three developments created an operational environment where Syrian calculations about Iranian presence shifted. Russian distancing reduced the protection that Russian-Syrian coordination had previously provided to Iranian assets. Gulf engagement created a potential alternative source of reconstruction funding and diplomatic rehabilitation that could reduce Syrian dependence on Iranian support. Israeli escalation increased the risk that Iranian presence would drag Syria into direct confrontation that Syrian government survival calculations could not sustain. Here is what actually happened behind closed doors based on intelligence community assessments that have reached me through channels I am not going to identify further. Syrian President Bashar al-Assad and senior Syrian military command concluded approximately 6 weeks ago that continued Iranian operational freedom in Syrian territory created unacceptable risk to Syrian government survival. That calculation was not built on ideological shift or new hostility toward Iran. It was built on cold assessment that Iran's escalating posture toward Israel, combined with Israel's willingness to strike Iranian assets in Syria, had created a trajectory leading toward Syrian involvement in Iranian-Israeli confrontation that Assad cannot survive. The specific trigger for the Damascus engagement appears to have been Iranian preparations for a large-scale drone and missile operation against Israeli targets, an operation that would have been launched from Syrian territory and would have inevitably triggered massive Israeli retaliation. Syrian intelligence detected preparation activity at Iranian installations near Damascus. Syrian command assessed that the operation would create existential threat to Syrian government control of the capital region. Syrian leadership decided that preventing the Iranian operation required demonstrating willingness to use force against Iranian assets. Let me tell you what this really means in terms of the regional power structure that has defined Middle Eastern conflict for the past decade. Iranian strategic doctrine has rested on the assumption that Syria represents secured territory, that Iranian force projection through Syrian territory faces no meaningful constraint from Syrian government decision-making, and that Assad's dependence on Iranian intervention during the civil war created permanent Syrian subordination to Iranian regional strategy. That assumption just broke. You think you've heard the worst of it. You haven't, not even close. What I have not yet told you is where this truly becomes dangerous for everyone involved, including populations far beyond the immediate region. The Syria-Iran relationship has functioned as a stability mechanism in ways that neither government's rhetoric acknowledges. Iranian access through Syria has provided Iran with options short of direct Iranian-Israeli confrontation, creating a release valve that has paradoxically reduced pressure for escalation originating from Iranian territory. Syrian cooperation has given Assad a powerful patron without requiring him to fully align with either Russian or Iranian regional priorities in ways that would eliminate all diplomatic flexibility. If that relationship fractures completely and the Damascus engagement represents an initial fracture point, then multiple constraints dissolve simultaneously. Iran loses its primary mechanism for threatening Israel without direct involvement, creating pressure for Iran to develop alternative force projection capabilities that would be inherently more escalatory. Israel loses the distinction between Syrian and Iranian targets that has limited Israeli operations to surgical strikes rather than sustained campaign. Syria loses the protection that Iranian presence has provided against regime change efforts, while simultaneously losing the financial and military support that Iranian relationship has delivered. Russia faces the specific nightmare of having to choose between its Syrian and Iranian relationships when those relationships enter direct conflict. Russian forces in Syria depend on Syrian government cooperation for their operational sustainability, Russian strategic cooperation with Iran serves Russian interests in constraining U.S. freedom of action across the Middle East and maintaining energy market leverage. A Syrian-Iranian break forces Russia to pick sides or attempt mediation from a position where Russian leverage over both parties has already diminished substantially. This is not just about Damascus and Tehran. This is about the structural architecture that has contained Middle Eastern conflict within specific boundaries, despite multiple flashpoints and crises. What happens when those boundaries dissolve, when the relationships that have channeled competition and managed escalation through understood frameworks suddenly stop functioning? That is when you see regional war not as distant possibility, but as emerging reality. Keep watching because what happens in the coming weeks will determine whether this incident represents manageable crisis or fundamental break. Iran has three basic options for response. First, Iran could accept Syrian position and negotiate new operational constraints on Iranian activity in Syria, essentially conceding that Syrian sovereignty places limits on Iranian freedom of action. That would represent a strategic retreat from a position Iran has held for over a decade. Second, Iran could attempt to reassert operational control through pressure campaign combining diplomatic demands, economic leverage, and implicit military threat. That option risks accelerating Syrian movement toward alternative patrons and could trigger Russian intervention to protect its own Syrian interests. Third, Iran could reduce or withdraw forces from Syria while attempting to maintain Lebanese Hezbollah supply lines through alternative routes, accepting diminished strategic position while avoiding direct confrontation with Syrian government. Syrian calculations are equally complex. Assad needs some external patron to maintain his government's survival against internal opposition and external pressure. If Iran is no longer viable in that role due to the confrontation risk Iranian presence creates, then Assad must either rehabilitate relationships with Russia, which has demonstrated limited willingness to bear the full cost of Syrian state reconstruction, or pursue rapprochement with Gulf states and potentially Western governments, which requires Syrian concessions on issues from Hezbollah to reconstruction contracts to potential political reforms. The scenario that intelligence analysts are wargaming as highest probability involves partial Iranian withdrawal combined with Syrian acceptance of limited Iranian presence under substantially tightened operational constraints. That outcome would represent significant Iranian strategic loss while avoiding complete break that neither government can readily afford. But arriving at that outcome requires both sides managing the immediate crisis without escalation that forecloses diplomatic resolution. The window for that managed outcome is measured in days, not weeks. The longer this situation persists without diplomatic framework for resolution, the more both sides become locked into positions that domestic political constraints prevent them from abandoning. Iranian hardliners who view the Syrian relationship as strategic necessity will demand forceful response to Syrian challenge of Iranian prerogatives. Syrian military and intelligence officials who assessed Iranian presence as creating unacceptable risk will resist any resolution that returns to status quo ante. What I have not yet addressed is the Israeli dimension, and that dimension may ultimately prove decisive. Israeli intelligence is observing this crisis with intense interest because Syrian-Iranian friction creates opportunities that Israel has sought for years. If Syria is willing to constrain or expel Iranian forces, that represents potential opening for Israeli-Syrian understanding that could fundamentally alter the strategic picture. Israel has never sought Syrian regime change with the intensity it has opposed Iranian presence in Syria. Israeli officials have repeatedly suggested that Syrian government willing to sever Iranian military cooperation could find substantial Israeli accommodation. The next 72 to 96 hours will reveal whether diplomatic channels can produce framework for de-escalation or whether this incident triggers cascade of responses that widen the breach. Watch for several indicators. First, whether Russia attempts public mediation and whether that mediation receives positive response from both Syrian and Iranian officials. Second, whether Iranian forces in Syria show signs of redeployment either toward exit routes or toward defensive postures, anticipating further Syrian action. Third, whether Israeli operations in Syria pause, which would signal Israeli interest in allowing space for Syrian-Iranian crisis to develop without Israeli interference. What you need to understand about the current strategic calculus is that no major actor in this situation has clearly optimal choices. Every option carries substantial risks, and every actor faces internal political constraints limiting flexibility. That combination of high stakes, limited options, and constrained flexibility creates conditions where unintended escalation becomes distinctly possible, even when no party desires wider conflict. I am not here to generate panic, but to provide truth as the intelligence picture reveals it. The Damascus engagement represents inflection point in a relationship that has shaped Middle Eastern conflict for more than a decade. Whether that inflection point leads to managed adjustment or fundamental rupture depends on decisions being made right now in Damascus, Tehran, Moscow, and Jerusalem. The next 2 weeks will determine whether we look back on this incident as crisis successfully contained or as the opening phase of strategic realignment that none of the parties fully anticipated and that carries consequences extending far beyond their immediate interests. The honest answer, however uncomfortable, is that the Syrian-Iranian relationship has been showing stress fractures for at least 18 months. The Damascus engagement did not create those fractures. It made them visible and it forced them into the open, where they can no longer be managed through quiet coordination and diplomatic ambiguity. Once that exposure happens, once the underlying tensions become public facts that both governments must address, rather than private concerns they can quietly accommodate, the range of possible outcomes expands in ways that include scenarios none of the parties want, but that systemic dynamics could nevertheless produce. Behind these tactical discussions are families, are populations whose futures depend on whether governments can navigate these crises without allowing them to explode into wider conflict. The people of Syria have endured more than a decade of war and destruction. The people of Iran face economic pressure and international isolation that has created genuine hardship. The people of Israel live under persistent security threats that shape their daily existence. The people of Lebanon watch as their country teeters on the edge of state failure while serving as arena for proxy competition. None of these populations benefit from escalation. All of them bear the costs when strategic calculations produce military confrontation. What happened in Damascus matters not because it represents isolated incident, but because it reveals the fragility of relationships that have structured regional conflict. When those relationships shift, when the understood frameworks stop functioning, when governments conclude that arrangements that served their interests for years now threaten their survival, that is when the carefully managed systems of competition and limited conflict can collapse into something far more dangerous. We are watching that possibility unfold in real time, and the decisions made in the coming days will determine which direction events move.